Thank you. So, Alexander Berkman wrote an essay once where he talked, it's called The Idea is the Thing, where he talked about what Antonio Gramsci called that interregnum, that moment when the credibility of a decaying regime is disintegrating, and yet we have not articulated what will come next. And Gramsci notes that in that moment many morbid symptoms appear, Trump being one. Berkman likens that period to the boiling of water in a kettle. He says you don't see it. You don't see that detachment from the ruling ideology, that discrediting of the ruling ideology. But once that ideology, whether it's neoliberalism or monarchy or whatever, is no longer is able to hold the loyalty of a population, those regimes collapse. Because the mechanisms that perpetuate power and defend power are no longer willing to sacrifice on its behalf. And as Berkman says, at a certain moment, you hear the whistle and you see the steam. But as Rosa Luxemburg points out, and as certainly Berkman would agree, as would Gramsci, that process of revolutionary change is slow and often invisible, because the facade of the superstructure remains in place. And that is precisely where we are in American history. We have yet to articulate what is going to come next. But it's incumbent upon those of us who care about a socialist society, equity, justice, and in particular racial justice, that we step outside of these structures, even if we remain a distinct minority, so that we provide another narrative, another vision. And I would encourage all of you, we did, Rick Wolf and I, and a great Luxembourg scholar from Canada did a seminar on Luxembourg. Go back and look. Rosa Luxemburg nailed it. She understood that the Social Democratic Party, of which she had been a member, committed collective suicide the moment it supported the war credits for the First World War. Nationalism is a disease, and nationalism has not only infected both parties in terms of the pillaging of the state on behalf of military expansionism and war crimes, but it also brings a very dangerous ideology. It brings a deification of the military and the organs of internal security. And it sucks people into its orbit and has as its disposal powerful forms of indoctrination, as anyone who has been to a sporting event or watched television understands. That mechanism of indoctrination is one that stokes the kinds of proto-fascism we see now at Trump rallies. And this has been a long time coming. And the Democrats have been as culpable as the Republicans in creating this very dangerous and toxic political and economic environment. I'm watching Hillary Clinton, and it is hard to detest political figures more than I detest Bill and Hillary Clinton. If you go back and look at the trajectory of their own rise, it is built on utter subservience to corporate power and white supremacy. Because remember, Bill and Hillary Clinton got their political start within the Democratic apparatus, by reversing all of the gains that Jesse Jackson had made in the Rainbow Coalition, whitewashing the Democratic platform to take out the calls for racial justice and diversity that had been at the centerpiece of Jackson's campaign. And that they began to speak in that coded language of white racism, which of course the Republicans speak in as well. Naomi Murakawa wrote a very fine book talking about that the Democrats under Biden and Clinton consciously decided to take the law and order issue from the Republicans by passing three strikes, you're outlaws, by massively expanding sentences, and by exploding, especially once Clinton passed the 1994 Omnibus Crime Bill, the physical structure of the prison industrial complex. And the whole notion of, it wasn't just the assault of mass incarceration, but in the service of corporate interests, it was the Clintons who destroyed welfare. And let's not forget that under our original system of welfare, 70% of the recipients were children. It was the Clintons who pushed through the first trade agreement, and I can assure you we'll be behind the next one. And the whole idea that Hillary Clinton is going to assign her husband the job of creating jobs, for anybody who knows even the slightest thing about recent American history, I mean, it would be amusing if it wasn't so tragic. In many ways, the Democratic Party looked at the working class, African Americans, the GBLT community, as their useful idiots, in the same way that the Republicans looked at the Christian right and nativists and abortion, anti-abortion advocates as their useful idiots, while all of them were serving the same centers of power. All of them were orchestrating what John Ralston Saul calls our corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. And it's over. They've won. As some of you may know, I did 2 events with Bernie Sanders. The first one created a deep enmity between myself and Sanders, took place in Wisconsin weeks after he, along with the rest of the Senate, had passed a resolution at the time of Israel's bombing of Gaza, saying that Israel had a right to defend itself. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I've been in Gaza when it's bombed by Israeli warplanes and U.S. munitions. I've actually picked up pieces of fragments from iron fragmentation bombs where it says made in Dayton, Ohio. But when you bomb, Israel, of course, is an apartheid state, and I never thought I'd have anything good to say about the racist apartheid state in South Africa, but at least they never use their attack jets to bomb townships. When you bomb people living in refugee camps who have no army, no navy, no artillery, no mechanized units, no command and control, that is not a war, that is murder. And Sanders spoke, and then I spoke, and I got up and called him out, along with every other senator, as an AIPAC wind-up doll. And he walked out. The next event with Sanders took place the night before the climate march with the great Shama Sawant and Bill McKibben and Naomi Klein. And Shama and I kept pushing Sanders to run as an independent for all of the reasons that are now readily apparent. The whole idea that the Democratic Party establishment would give Sanders a fair hearing. He's been a senator for 25 years. And I believe that he was actually politically that naive. He has been in the pockets of the Clintons for a long time. He campaigned for Bill Clinton in '92. He campaigned for Bill Clinton in '96, after NAFTA, after the welfare, after the omnibus crime. So he knew what Clinton was about. And in 2004, and some of you know I was writing Nader's major policy speeches for him. In 2004, Sanders was one of the voices calling on Ralph not to run. Essentially, he has worked out a very Faustian bargain with the Democratic establishment. He, as Glenn said, has seniority and is with the caucus. He campaigns for the Democratic candidates, and he is used, like all members of the liberal establishment, to discredit those people and those movements that challenge that establishment, including everyone in Vermont who is attempting to build a third party. And in response, the Democrats do not run a serious candidate against. Remember, the Clinton super PAC gave him Sanders money for his last campaign. What he didn't count on, or I think what he believed, was that despite the rules as they were configured, he thought that he could compete fairly in the primaries. And of course, we have now seen, Nevada was stolen from him. What the Democrats have done, and remember that the taxpayers, we pay for the primaries. The Democratic Party doesn't pay for the primaries. We pay for it. But the Democratic parties run them. And how do they run it? They, in most states, refuse to allow independents to vote in the primary. So in that last cycle where Sanders won Rhode Island, that was the only state that allowed independents to vote for a Democratic candidate. That, coupled with the superdelegates, coupled with the massive amounts of money that has been collected by the Clinton campaign, essentially stole the election. And Bernie is now using the word rigged, but he's right. In a free election, absent all of those mechanisms, he would have won, and he would beat Trump. But the establishment doesn't want a Sanders. They're nervous about Trump, not because they think that he's going to do anything on behalf of working men and women, but because he's unpredictable. And so they will consolidate behind Clinton. I will close by saying that, especially given the effects of climate change, we have no time left to play this game. These corporate forces, which have already extinguished our democracy, are now rapidly extinguishing the systems of life on which we depend for existence. And we owe it to our children, I'm a father, to step outside this system and begin to fight back, to stop getting caught up in the moment of a particular election cycle, to understand that building a serious movement will put us in the political wilderness perhaps for a decade. Just as Syriza in Greece started when it began polling at 4% and eventually took power. And finally, we will never achieve power through electoral politics, but only by building movements. Yes, we can look for figures like Jill Stein or others who give expression to that. But without these movements, we're finished. And that means that all of our energy, which I spend most of my energy doing, has to be invested. I was speaking to anti-fracking activists a little while ago in Denver. Very moving. Kids with backpacks, 400 of them. Rashes, respiratory problems from being in the fracking fields. I just spoke to 300 BDS activists. Yes, I support boycott, divestment, and sanction of Israel. Of course I do. And Black Lives Matter, the fight for the minimum wage, that's where and we have to knit these groups together, and we have to begin to carry out sustained acts of mass civil disobedience, because at this point, reform, at least within the formal structures of power, has been taken from us. Thank you.